John and I decided to ping pong today, so we'll be back and forth between the two of us, I guess. So anyhow, we have all our members. Is that correct, Jim?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, yeah, good, excellent. So good. I want to thank everybody for participating. John has a time constraint of, I think he said 2 o'clock. Is that right, John? So we'll
2:15.
2:15. Okay. Well, we have basically we have one agenda item and discussion. So I think we should be able to make it within John's time constraint without too much of a problem. We have primarily one agenda item today, which is a discussion item, and that's First Avenue. John and I had a talk with Jim the other day, and although most of the committee members and other people that are tuning into the Zoom are probably familiar with the presentation, there may be some people from the public who are not aware of it. So basically, John and I requested through Jim that the city walk us through their First Avenue PowerPoint presentation, which I think is the identical one that was presented to the regional council. Is that correct?
RTA board,
RTA board.
That is the presentation that I put online, and I believe that's the one that that Mr. Hartley will be walking us through, and we will be asking him to share his screen and go from there.
Okay, that sounds good. So without any further ado, do you have any other comments, John? Otherwise, we can get into the presentation.
No, thank you very much, Chris.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, I guess I should begin then.
Yes, Patrick. Yep. Yeah. Please go ahead and we're anticipating maybe a 15 or 20 minute presentation from you at the most, and we'll follow up with some questions afterwards. And there may be questions that you're not prepared to answer today, which is fine because obviously we're not going to make a recommendation or formulate a recommendation today either. So with that, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, and appreciate the opportunity to present on the project. Talk a little bit about the details and kind of what our rationale was for doing the needs assessment and what our findings were. And again, as was mentioned, this was the same presentation we gave to TMC and the RTA board, and it's also pulling a lot of the material out of the actual needs assessment document, which I believe has been shared with this body. So my name is Patrick Hartley with the City of Tucson. I am the Complete Streets Program Coordinator and have been kind of shepherding this project through the needs assessment process. So a little bit of background, we did the needs assessment really to revisit the RTA defined scope that was in the 2006 ballot, to revisit some of the cost assessments, look at some different corridor alternatives, understanding that there's been rising costs over the last 15 years since the RTA was passed, and look if we could deliver the functionality on the corridor within kind of the ballot amount or the cost amounts that were identified in the RTA plan. And we did so by defining the multimodal facilities and connections for 2045, which was really the horizon year that we were looking at, consistent with the PEG RMAP. We wanted to do so incorporating the City of Tucson Complete Streets policy. We're now viewing all of our transportation improvements through that lens, that's the official policy of the City of Tucson. So all of our improvements are really thinking more comprehensively about the needs on these corridors, using that different framework and looking at opportunities for incorporating intelligent transportation systems, smart signalization, other things that we could do for efficiency. So I'm sure as many of you are aware, the project extends about 3 miles from Grant Road to River Road. It's currently a 5-lane roadway, 4 through lanes with a 2-way left turn lane. Some of the intersections do also have right turn lanes, some do not. And looking at kind of the corridor context it's in, north of the project extent is a 4-lane divided in Pima County, north of River Road. And south of Grant Road, we have a 4-lane continuation with the 2-way left turn lane. It's a very commercial corridor. There is some residential in this vicinity, multifamily primarily, and it transitioned to primarily residential north and south of this segment. As was mentioned, it was identified in the RTA plan, obviously. It's what we're here today for about $75 million, $3 million contribution from the City of Tucson, $71.4 million from the RTA board, or from the RTA rather. And it's all been estimated in 2006 dollars. And we did look at that for CPI, CPI inflator, and that would be the equivalent of about plus million in 2022 valuation. So in terms of why we did the needs assessment, as we recognize it's been 15 years since the RTA plan was initially approved, we wanted to verify that I think a lot of the assumptions that the RTA project list was built on were still valid today as we look at kind of going more, more broadly into this project. And I think some of the things that we found is that our needs certainly have evolved in the city. The traffic projections, which we'll talk a little bit about today, have never really materialized on this corridor. It was anticipating pretty significant growth in Pima County and along this corridor, were what the assumptions of the 2006 project scope was built on. We're nowhere close to that in the 15 years since the RTA plan has been passed. So we wanted to revisit what the actual needs were on this corridor. And I think that's true both from just the traffic demand, but I think Jim's talked about this a few times, also kind of from the revenue side, is that the revenues haven't materialized, the traffic demand hasn't materialized. So we wanted to see if there's a different project that makes sense based on what we understand of the needs of this corridor. As I mentioned, the city also has a different policy framework that we're operating under, which is that complete streets policy. And we're thinking more comprehensively of the needs of all users on the roadway and not necessarily using just the vehicular mobility consideration as the primary driver of project identification. We needed to look at our cost estimates. There's been pretty significant inflation, particularly in the last 2 years, which we can talk about, but in the time since it's passed, and we needed to revisit some of our assumptions on these different project scopes and then look at those two different alternatives with these updated cost estimates, all for the purpose of really right sizing our public investment, making sure that we're investing the dollars to meet the needs that we have and are anticipating over the horizon of this plan, and not necessarily overinvesting or misallocating the funds that are important in the community. And the reason we did it also in this kind of phased approach and what we wanted to go in for this needs assessment prior to getting into the design process was that we wanted to establish a design scope before a project scope before advancing to the more detailed design work, because we didn't want to kind of get bogged down again in these scope discussions as we moved into design. So we saw this as a much cleaner option as opposed to kind of what happened with the Broadway project where the scope work and the design kind of got tangled up in a longer process that could, ended up being more difficult, more expensive, and more time consuming. We thought we could address the kind of that scope issue separately through the needs assessment before advancing the project into design. So we had a community agreed upon scope for the project. We did submit this for discussion by the TMC and the RTA board in response to an RTA letter, again, recognizing some of what I talked about, that the pattern and velocity of the growth has changed in our community. We're being responsive to that and really trying to meet the threshold of meeting current and future anticipated capacity without diminishing the voter approved functionality of the corridor. So that's some of the things that we looked at through the needs assessment. As I mentioned, we discussed where we looked at two different corridor alternatives, a 4-lane divided section versus a 6-lane divided section. This is all conceptual at this point, but we wanted to represent what we were kind of evaluating and do enough, really kind of go far enough down the road of design to get a cost estimate based on the materials anticipated. But I do want to just emphasize that we have done no design on this project yet. So there's still a lot of flexibility in some of the individual decisions that could be made in terms of how space is going to be allocated within the right of way, what we'll be doing at specific intersections, where the bike lane will be located, the widths and all of these elements. But conceptually, we talked about 100-foot versus 120-foot cross section for the 4-lane and the 6-lane. And this will all be potentially evolving during the design process, obviously, because we'll be working with the task force, making sure we're doing robust business engagement, what have you, and seeing what would be most appropriate in given locations. So based on the estimates that we came up with in 2019 as part of the needs assessment, we're looking at the 4-lane section at about $73.2 million in 2019 dollars, and the 6-lane at about $91.6 million. Now, understand that this is now 2 years out of date as well. So even these costs have probably begun to escalate since we've done this estimate. So that's something to keep in mind. We've been seeing those project costs come in well higher in the last year or two than we've been anticipating. And I'm sure that the materials that we based this on would also be affected by that cost escalation. This does also not include kind of upstream, downstream detention work for some of the drainage issues. So that's going to be an ongoing discussion. And actually following this meeting, we will be beginning some talks with Pima County Flood Control to see if there's any sort of partnership for some of the upstream work, particularly on Navajo Wash, to see if we can pull some of that off before it gets to the interface with the roadway. In terms of the existing conditions and so the functionality that we want to deliver on, the existing bridge over the Rito is about 80% of its lifespan and is not, accommodating or built to current standards of what we expect to meeting the needs of all users. Is a very narrow bike lane, non-ADA accessible 4-foot sidewalk. And it is also anticipated that the remaining life of this before it becomes starts to suffer structural fatigue would be about 12 years. So we see this as a great opportunity under this project to address one of our aging bridges over the Rito, bring it up to standard and tie it in fully with the corridor. From a safety perspective, First Avenue really underperforms a couple of the parallel corridors in terms of the number of crashes and particularly the number of pedestrian crashes that we're seeing. So if we compare the pedestrian crashes, including the injury crashes on First Avenue to Oracle, Stone, and Campbell, you can see that it's almost twice as many as on Oracle, even though the traffic volumes are considerably higher on Oracle than First. And 3 to 4 times or 1.5 times and like 3 times higher than on Stone and Campbell. Campbell, obviously another commercial corridor, has comparable volumes to First Avenue. Stone obviously has lower volumes, but it is underperforming parallel corridors that are operating in a pretty similar area of the city. The same can be seen on all vehicle crashes. Oracle Road does have higher number of all vehicle crashes, again, probably driven by that overall traffic volume, but it is considerably higher than Stone and Campbell and pretty similar on bike crashes. In terms of the facilities that are available on First Avenue currently for pedestrians, about 64% of the existing corridor has sidewalk coverage, and you can see the locations of that here. There are significant gaps in where there are no sidewalks or where you just have situations where you have asphalt and kind of a pedestrian walkway of sorts. Although there is pretty high pedestrian activity in this area, particularly between Prince and Fort Lowell. We have a high number of hawk activations. You can see that we've been tracking along the corridor. And this is also, I think, plays out in where we see a high number of crashes. A couple of years ago, we looked at it, and the section between Prince and Fort Lowell had one of the highest concentrations of pedestrian crashes in the city. I think that's pretty indicative of where you see those volumes. You've got crossings of, intersections of high frequency bus routes there, for example. It's driving some of that pedestrian demand as well as a lot of just the commercial activities. So for kind of a center city arterial, there is a high level of pedestrian activity. It's also a frequent transit route, which I think is driving some of that and contributing to it. And then we're just not really providing much in the way of pedestrian facilities. Actually, I was walking it the other day, just doing some recon on it in preparation for an event we did. And I almost got hit by a car pulling out of a driveway just in the 20 minutes that I was walking out there. So I think it's indication that we certainly have some challenges. It was also identified as part of our pedestrian high injury network in the city of Tucson. So a couple of years ago, we did the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, identifying the top 10% of corridors where we see the highest number of pedestrian fatalities and severe injuries and fatalities and overall crashes, kind of severity weighted. And that entire extent of the First Avenue corridor showed up as one of our high crash areas for pedestrians. So I think in terms of the functionality and what the improvements are, we're really centering the safety issue and the safety improvements that we can make through this corridor, recognizing that it is really underperforming, and in particularly underperforming in pedestrian safety. And it's also not providing the facilities to improve that safety currently. So that's going to be a major framework and kind of driver of our design decisions once we get into that phase in the process. In terms of motor vehicle mobility, what we have seen since about 1998, this is drawn from PEG's traffic counts that are taken year over year, kind of on a 3-year rotating basis and averaging those. between 98 and 2021 is the traffic volume since that time has largely been flat to decreasing. After 2008, when all the traffic went down following the Great Recession, we did see that play out on First Avenue as well. It had been flat until about 2008 and really fell off the table and hasn't recovered since then. The RTA, being developed here, you could see that there was some indication that traffic volumes would be increasing, which I think is the assumption that the RTA plan was built on. But looking back to 98 year over year, we're seeing about a 1% annual decline in traffic volumes on First Avenue. So that is our base and kind of the background. What we did through the needs assessment then is we looked at our existing traffic volumes, and when we projected those out to 2045, which is the year that the PEG model was available to and is consistent with the current long-range transportation plan, or the PEG RMAP. For the entire extent, the existing traffic volumes are about 28,000 vehicles per day. And you can see that that varies between about 23,000 or 26,000 really, and 30,000 within the corridor area. So there are some higher and some lower areas. And then what we did is recognizing that we don't have, we can't predict or project traffic out to the future if the past is any indication with perfect certainty with a crystal ball. So what we did is we looked at two different conditions, a high growth and a low growth projection on the corridor. And we're trying to operate within those ranges, understanding that it might fall somewhere between those two. So the low growth projection corridor average would show about a 4,000 vehicle per day increase in 2045. The high projection would show about a 10,000 vehicle per day increase. So ranging from 32,000 or about 4,000 vehicle per day to 38,000 or 16 to 30% increase. So that is what was driving a lot of our assumptions about the corridor capacity and functionality. When we think about, are we delivering on the commitment, the promise that was made to the voters in 2006 in terms of the functionality outcomes, in terms of the capacity outcomes. So pulling from what the communication from the RTA, as well, the RTA administrative code, is that the functionality is not to be diminished. The TMC and the Citizens Advisory Committee had specific capacity and or performance improvements in mind when recommending highway improvement projects as well as transit improvement projects. So what we wanted to do is we looked at this, and then from the communication from the RTA, it's that projects do not sacrifice the expected benefits. So we wanted to compare not the 2022 condition to the 2045 condition in terms of the 4 and the 6 lane alternative, but really look at whether we were delivering on what the expected benefits of the project were in 2030, which is when the RTA was modeled for on those 2006 assumptions. So this wasn't in the needs assessment report, but it was kind of a supplemental analysis we did to make sure that we were delivering on what was promised to voters based on our new understanding of the traffic volumes. So if we compare what the RTA plan was built on, I wanted to say it was about 50,000 plus vehicles per day in 2030 for the First Avenue corridor is what the assumption of that project scope was, what kind of drove that project scope. What we're seeing today, you saw, is that we were seeing 32,000 to 38,000 vehicles per day in 2045. So we wanted to take that growth rate and compare the 2045 against really what the 2006 assumptions were for 2030, if that makes sense, since we didn't have equal year 2045 for both. So under the high volume scenario at the segment level, we are anticipating an 11.4% reduction based on the 2019 traffic volumes in 2045 compared to what 2030 was showing us for the RTA plan. So 15 years later, 11% lower traffic volume projections, and that is the high growth scenario. If we look at the low growth scenario and considering that the traffic volumes have been decreasing 1% year over year for the last 25 years, maybe this would be a more reasonable expectation, hard to say. Anyway, 25% reduction or 24.2% reduction in what the RMAP traffic projections had us at 2045 compared to what the RTA was assuming for 2030. So 15 years later, 25% lower traffic projected. Same for the intersections. On the high growth scenario, it's about a 7% reduction anticipated versus 17.2%. So 7.2% for the high growth, 17.2% for the low growth scenario. Again, 15 years further into the future. So what we did is then we compared the 4-lane alternative and the 6-lane alternative against what the 2030 RTA expectation was for the AM and the PM peak. And essentially what you see is that the 4-lane cannot really accommodate the 2006 traffic volumes, but it can accommodate the updated projections in a way that is very comparable to what was anticipated and committed to the voters in 2006. So a better way of showing it, I think, would be this one. So essentially what we're seeing here is the 2019 4-lane alternative. So when we say 2019, it's the 4-lane alternative based on the 2019 model projections for 2045 is showing levels of service D and C at AM peak on the low alternative and C, D, and E on the high scenario. If I know there's a lot of things moving around here with the different dates and the scenarios and what have you, but I think in essence, the takeaway here is that the 2019 model projections on the 4-lane perform as well or better than what was anticipated for the level of service outcomes on the 2006 projections for 2030 on a 6-lane alternative. So the argument we're making is that we are providing the mobility benefits or the functionality of what was promised to the voters with 2 fewer through lanes. So you can see that the level of service here for the AM peak for the 6-lane was level of service E, C, D, C, D, C, D. We've got it at AM peak low, D, C, 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 and high E, D, C, 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 E. Pretty comparable, a little over in the high scenario, and the same with the PM peak. Let me know if that doesn't make any sense to you, but that's essentially what we're showing. And that was the intersections level of service. I apologize for that. And then for the corridor level of service, we have the same situation or the same relationship in that the AM peak at the modeled for 2030 southbound and northbound were level of service D and C. At the low projection, we have level of service C and C projected out 15 years later, and the high projection puts us the same at the original corridor level of service at D and C. And then at the PM peak, again, the high traffic growth scenario has the same level of service anticipated as what was anticipated for the 6-lane in 2030 DE level of service, and the low outperforms at PM in both directions what was anticipated in 2006 for 2030.
Hey, Patrick, this is John Bernal. Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
So are we saying that under the 4-lane and 6-lane configurations, there's no difference in the intersection design or control?
No, so if we're comparing year to year, the 6-lane and the 4-lane out to 2045, the 6-lane is going to outperform the 4-lane in terms of level of service and throughput. What we're comparing here was the 6-lane on the 2006 projected volumes for this corridor versus the city's proposed 4-lane for the 2019 traffic projections.
No, I understood that. In fact, take it back one more slide, please.
Yep.
Yeah, that one. So when we say that the 4-lane is, and the AM peak is still level of service E at Prince Road, and the 6-lane was the same, and this is the intersection level of service, you're saying the intersection design is identical in those 2 cases?
It's largely driven by the volumes in this instance. So we'd be looking at about 33,000 vehicles per day here versus 50,000 vehicles per day here going through that intersection.
Okay, all right,
So
thanks.
Patrick, so you don't have a comparison of 4 lanes versus 6 lanes with the same projected volumes, do you?
That is in the needs assessment. So it's not part of the presentation. What we were showing here was the functionality comparison against what was
Okay.
committed to the
So
vote.
just off the top of your head, to answer John's question, what would be the difference, you think?
I want to say at that location, it was probably E for the 4-lane and D for the 6-lane.
Hey, Patrick, this is Kurt Lewick. Did Kittleson run a synchro analysis on these that we could look at? What I would like to see is how they coded the intersection in relative to the number of turn lanes and through lanes, and how the signals were, the signal timing and so on. I mean, did it get up to 180 seconds during the peak hour, or did you limit it to 120? To me, the most critical element of this project of changing scope is how well the intersections perform.
Okay.
Because, the spacing between the intersections isn't really all that long enough that the segment performance means all that much, because it really is driven by how well the intersections perform. So, a couple of things I'd like to be able to look at is the left turn performance, because, the overall intersection signalized intersection performance is really driven by how long the left turn delay is. So I was just kind of interested in looking at that technical analysis to see what assumptions were made under these different scenarios. I mean, the bottom line is if we get the intersections to realistically work very well, then probably the change in cross section from 6 lanes to 4 lanes really isn't going to matter. But the key is getting the intersections to perform well at the movement level, not at the overall intersection level.
Mhm.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I can follow up with Kittleson to get the specifics on what they ran.
Yeah.
I know they did use synchro, but I don't know what parameters they put on it. And I can say this does assume improvements at the intersection, the 4-lane alternative. So this isn't to be confused with the no build. So there would be additional turn lanes at the intersections, installed right turn lanes as part of the improvements that we would be proposing. So that would improve performance. And we compared that against the no build to 2045.
Right.
Obviously perform better, does not perform as well as the 6-lane as Farhad.
Sure. I know we're looking at things here at the planning level, but obviously that has great implication on what happens when you get into design also. So, if we end up, if our task force ends up recommending to the TMC that a 4-lane cross section is probably going to be okay, I, for one, want to be comfortable that the intersections truly are going to work well. And I want to see what does that look like. I mean, are you going to need triple left turns someplace along the way, or double left turns, or split level phasing, things like that. I think we're far enough along that we can look at some of the practical elements of how the intersections need to be designed now, because these traffic volumes that you have currently are the ones obviously that the designers are going to be using. I don't think if the design starts in 6 months that the forecasts are going to change again.
Right.
So hopefully, if you can provide that information to us, Patrick, I think it would be, it would assuage at least my fears and maybe a couple of other task force members on the intersection operation.
Okay. Yeah, we'll follow up with the Kittleson folks and we'll get you
Great.
too.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, appreciate the question.
Uh-huh.
So I think this follows on as what we're arguing is that the current projections show that the 4-lane option operating at desirable performance under the low growth scenario at all intersections and at segments. And you can see that here again, the low growth is we are comfortable with that. We do have this level of service E, but this actually is at the River Road approaches and is not the First Avenue approaches, which are driving that lower level of service. And then under the high growth scenario, it does follow desired performance in one direction during the peak hour in 2045 for the segment and at a couple intersections, but the functionality between what the RTA was built on and assumed was not diminished, even though it is 15 years later into the future for that design year. So it's performing better to or equal than what was promised to the voters for 2030 in 2045. And in terms of the functionality test, we wanted to look at this more comprehensively as opposed to just the vehicular mobility issues. So in terms of the vehicular mobility, we do argue that the functionality is not diminished for the reasons that we just stated. Based on that, the transit service will be comparable between what was committed to the voters in 2006 and what we're prepared to deliver, because the congestion would be similar, which would affect bus service in similar ways. Both projects, be it the 6-lane or the 4-lane, can upgrade the bus stops, add that functionality. We have a number of bus stops on First Avenue that are simply a bench and a sign. The pedestrian amenities, including pedestrian safety, both the modernization project and what the 6-lane could add continuous sidewalks, more crossing opportunities. So the functionality of this, the modernization project does not diminish that functionality. Same with bicycle facilities. We can build to current standards under both conditions. In terms of drainage, both projects would replace aged on-site storm drainage. Either the 6-lane or the 4-lane would require additional consideration of cross drainage for full functionality, particularly thinking about that Navajo wash crossing. That's going to be an issue regardless of which of these alternatives we advance. Both alternatives would reconfigure intersections to improve safety and flow of traffic. Both would replace the bridge, no functionality diminished. And both would provide a median as currently proposed in those cross sections, which would add access control and improve safety, so the functionality would not be diminished. So in all cases, we can deliver the functionality of what was promised to the voters at a lower cost with less impact to the adjacent properties on the corridor. And then this was also brought out to the public. I shared some of this information. I'll just move through this really quickly, but we did about 3 or 4 months of public outreach, conducted a number of surveys, did intercept surveys on buses, went to farmers markets, went to the libraries, knocked on doors along the corridor, brought on a public relations firm to walk the corridor and talk to all of the businesses along First Avenue, and generated some reports out of that, what our findings were. We offered a survey asking people what their preferences of the 2 alternatives, and by a 2-to-1 margin, community members did prefer the 4-lane alternative for a variety of reasons: less costly, less impactful to the adjacent businesses and residences, less likely to break up the neighborhoods in terms of crossing over First Avenue, a lot of pedestrian activity there, and also not necessarily the right response to kind of the climate emergency as the city looks to move to emphasizing a change in mode and kind of a change in way of thinking of our transportation system. We did get regional responses from the survey, so we didn't restrict it just to city residents in any way. Obviously, as it can be expected, the majority of them did come in kind of the most impacted areas, but we also got quite a few from areas north of the project extent who may be using this more as a commuter corridor than are living right next to it. And what we saw of all of the highest responding zip codes, all of them preferred the 4-lane alternative over the 6-lane. I will say that these up here did have much narrower margins in their preference of the 4-lane over the 6-lane, with these folks having the highest preference for the 4-lane. And then we brought this to Mayor and Council. Our Mayor and Council did approve a recommendation of the 4-lane alternative and advancing that to engage the RTA on the scope change. And that is what we have brought in front of you today into the TMC, and are looking forward to the discussion. So that's kind of the ins and outs of the project, and we can take any questions. And Robin Rain is also here to answer questions.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. That was very helpful to walk us through it. I had just a couple of more questions, but I'll let the other task force members and the co-chair ask their questions first, and I'll come back with mine as we finish up. So jump in, anybody.
Yeah, Patrick, let me ask on safety, on pedestrian safety. I noticed in the one graphic you show signal or pedestrian crossing locations with signals. So what is the attempt going to be, or the plan going to be, to improve pedestrian safety?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost by putting that raised median, and then that's going to have a huge pedestrian safety benefit. So that improves pedestrian safety at unmarked locations by about 40%. So that by itself will be a major benefit. And then we would look to increase the number of beacons for pedestrian crossing where we don't have current signals. And I think our goal would be to provide a safe pedestrian crossing at least every quarter mile along First Avenue. So we've got a number of future bike boulevards, for example, that intersect with this roadway. Those would be locations where we would obviously target for including additional beacons, hawk lights to facilitate those crossings. So I think those two elements would be huge. And then we would look at consolidating driveways to eliminate those driveway impacts. And where the right-of-way and space allows, at least set the driveway back from the roadway. That's more of a comfort issue, but can have a minor safety benefit as well. Also, a big one, obviously, lighting. So north of Roger Road, there's basically no lighting on First Avenue. We see a lot of nighttime crashes, so we would also increase lighting.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Frank, Bill, any comments, questions?
Is Bill talking? But I think he's muted.
Oh, yeah, Bill. We can't hear you, Bill.
Sorry about that.
There you go.
You referred early on about some upstream retention detention facilities, particularly on Navajo Wash. Does that mean that the budget estimate that you have included in here is not capable of being able to handle the flow that's coming at there? And so that without having a drainage function done upstream, that the budget that is programmed for First Avenue still doesn't work?
Yeah, that's our understanding. If we were to do regional scale flood control on Navajo, the budget does include kind of on-site drainage improvements for the project, but we would have to look at some suboptimal, perhaps, alternatives to that dip crossing at Navajo to facilitate the movement of water across the roadway so we could provide all-weather access in a 100-year event. Obviously, ideally, we would like to go upstream and address some of the challenges on Navajo Wash, which is something we'll be talking to flood control about, but that is not included. We estimate that in the range right now of 10 to 20 million, but that we haven't done a really thorough drainage study on that yet. Robin?
To be clear, that's the same, whether we stick with the RTA original scope or go to the diminished scope. So Navajo, turning Navajo into because Navajo Road is the wash there, right?
Right.
So turning that road into grade separation or whatever has never been part of this. And so we didn't consider it during the feasibility because if we want to solve that problem also, which I would argue is probably the right thing to do, it wasn't necessarily something that the RTA project was originally planned to solve. We would want to do it in the crossing itself, but upstream, downstream, we weren't looking to solve. So while we would want to put where we can a culvert crossing in the major washes, we weren't thinking about this project solving upstream, downstream detention issues.
Understood.
So
Thank you.
we just discarded it as one of the things to consider with the scope change.
Frank, you had your hand up?
Yes, I did. And I'm going back to the fact that we had to propose a group of projects when we went through this 15 years ago, whenever that was. And we had to describe them in fair detail. Not that it's bad to change as we go along, but I think that, and since I'm usually one of the people that needs to help with some of this election stuff, I'm trying to visualize how we're going to, with a straight face, say to some of these voters, we're changing this, and yeah, we're going from a 6-lane to a 4-lane, but it's really going to be the same. And quite apart from the technical analysis, which I understand and I don't disagree with, what is going to be the approach that now ties this into what was one of the major problems that I can remember over the last 30 or 40 years that I'm aware of in Tucson, that you needed to get the voters to approve something so they can actually make this into a reality. And what are we going to tell if we wholesale start changing some of the proposals? I think the question is, what is the rationale that is going to be used to the voters that say, 4 lanes the same as 6 lanes, because then why are we doing all this? And I have some concerns about how this would work in reality, how we'd get through another election period. One of the things that I took away from the last election was that this last one passed because we promised X to the voters and we said we were going to deliver X to the voters. Like all planners, I understand things change. I understand that we modify things as we go along. But I think that there needs to be some caution into how we present that. And there needs to be some caution that goes more to the planning aspects. I fully understand that there's been changes in the number of people that have been using it, and the number of what's the ultimate capacity for the roadway compared to where we're at now and compared to what we put. So I'm just raising this as food for thought, that perhaps there's another series of issues here that we probably need to be considering as we go. And I'm not suggesting, no, you don't make any changes. That's silly. We always make changes as we go along with things, but how we do it, I think, is going to be the key. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Frank. That's a good point. Really, I think you're thinking beyond the RTA right now, and the public perception of what we do, what we recommend, and what happens with those recommendations. So that really is the tough nut, I think. And Jim DeGroot and I had a discussion last week, and one of my comments to Jim was, if we can fault the original plan on anything, it was its inflexibility. And one of the reasons it was inflexible, because at the time there was a lack of confidence in local government because of some previous issues and bonding and other things. So it was unnecessarily rigid. And hopefully with the renewal, the refreshing of the RTA, there's a little more flexibility built into it, and that the projects are more goal oriented than cross-section oriented. So that's my typical 2 cents worth. So Bob, are you still there, Bob? Do you have any comments?
Yeah, I am. Actually, my concern was similar to what Bill raised regarding the impacts of drainage with the upstream and downstream detention retention. So I think that was covered. But I guess moving to Frank's concern, I think it's more of a lessons learned, how to educate those non-technically oriented to understand the level of service that we're providing, that it really is apples to apples. So, there's a challenge there.
Yes, yeah, for sure. So who are we missing? I think we got, anybody else have any additional comments or questions? Bill.
Yeah, just one tied to Frank's, and I agree with you, Frank, that when you go back out to the public and you say, yeah, I promised you 6 lanes, but you only got 4, people are going to look at it and say you lied. And that's the position we don't want to be in. But I think it's easy to go back and refer to a couple of elections ago in Alaska when people were talking about the bridge to nowhere. And I saved so much money because I didn't build a stupid bridge just because someone gave me money for it. And I think that's the argument that we want to make to the public is we weren't stupid enough to build 6 lanes that weren't going to be used. Look at the roadway, it's functioning fine. So it is how you spin it. But the easy argument is going to be you promised 6 and you didn't deliver. And we need to be careful.
Right. Great. Thanks. Any other discussion?
Well, I had one about the bridge, Curtis.
Yeah.
I saw in some report that the bridge over the Rito does not meet ADA. Is that strictly ramps to the pedestrian ways, or is it more than that?
Yeah, it's the major gaps between where the sidewalks are and where they tie into kind of the approach sidewalk. So it just kind of turns into dirt for a while, and then you have a 4-foot sidewalk. Now, the 4-foot sidewalk, I believe, also wouldn't meet ADA because we would need to provide a 5-foot passing pad every 200 feet along that span. Mm-hmm. So we want to at least get to a 5-foot.
Yeah. So,
go ahead, John. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, related to the bridge, Patrick, you'd mentioned during your presentation that the bridge has probably at best 12 years of life left. That's, I would assume, as of today. It's going to take probably 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 years for this project to be designed and constructed, in which case that bridge would only have maybe 7 or 8 years of life left. And originally I was going to challenge the need to replace that bridge, but really the time is ticking on it. And one of the other benefits of replacing the bridge with a newer structure is what happens with the loop underneath it. That's not a particularly nice underpass of that bridge now for the loop. So that was my comment on the bridge.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And great comment. And I want to say that there are no known safety issues. It's not an imminent, risk of collapse or anything like that. It's just that within that 12 years would be when we start to maybe see some of the structural fatigue issues, and would want a more thorough evaluation of the bridge structure to see if we want to start thinking about weight posting at that point. But right now it's structurally sound, no weight posted.
Mm-hmm. Well, all of these bridges are gateways into the Tucson community from the census designated communities like Catalina Foothills and Casas Adobes and so on. So, putting a new bridge in also gives you the opportunity to make it a landmark with public art and so on. And we're really overall enhance the overall aesthetics of the corridor and the entrance into the Tucson area as well. So I did have a comment on the access to the businesses. Access to the businesses now, as you mentioned, this is a commercial corridor, Patrick, is pretty much unimpeded because of the center left turn lane. Going to a median, of course, will change the accessibility. If somebody's southbound, they want to get to a business on the east side, they're going to either likely have to change the route, circulate through the neighborhood somehow, or make a U-turn. And with a narrow center left turn lane and 2 11-foot lanes, it begins to become very difficult to make a U-turn there as well, particularly with the option of putting the bike lane behind a planter strip and adjacent to the curb. That really starts to, trucks are not going to be able to make a U-turn at all. And anybody with a larger SUV is not going to be able to make a U-turn either. With the 2 lanes and a 7-foot bike lane, that opens it up to U-turn possibilities for at least for passenger vehicles in there, which makes the accessibility to the businesses much better than otherwise.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's something we're definitely going to be looking at as we get into design. Again, this is all very conceptual at this point.
Sure. One
of the things we could look at would be, if we do put a protected bike lane in there, would be dropping that protective element of that median separation at the locations where those U-turns will be being made, for example. So it would open up that additional kind of 7 feet for that movement, for example, at those locations.
Sure.
So we can explore all those different options. And if we need to widen out that median a little bit without unduly impacting kind of the costs and the acquisitions that would be required, that will be part of the balancing act, I think, of the design process.
Sure.
Robert, wanted to add something?
Well, just that, especially in those locations where U-turns would be sort of intersection related also. And that's where we would have a wider median anyway, because we'd want to have some sort of pedestrian
have refuge.
Refuge there, and you can't make that in a narrow median. So
Sure.
I would say in general, you're also going to have wider medians in those areas.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good.
Hey,
Point.
Curtis, I've got one more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Either Robin or Patrick, in our scope change review criteria, one of the items that we added to that was any land use considerations with a project scope change. Is there anything from your development services folks that would either support or oppose the change in configuration we're talking about?
So we have been talking with the Development Services Department, and they are supportive of the concept. And I think one of the things we'd like to do at the appropriate time would be maybe see an opportunity if there would be a more supportive land use plan that could be developed in conjunction with the corridor plan, like we've done on Broadway, for example, looking at those overlay options, if there's another appropriate kind of land use overlay or policy approach to that. So I think that would be part of the discussion. We didn't want to do it too early because we want to be very cautious about the kind of the entitlements as we think about the acquisitions. So we want to.
And as far as just to add a little bit, as far as land use considerations, existing land use, I think the adjacent property owners, especially the commercial, are very aware that the 6-lane wipes them out.
Great, thanks. What I noticed the 4-lane cross section requires would use 100 feet of right of way, and the 6-lane about 120 feet. What is the current right of way? It looked to me like it kind of varied between 80 and 100 feet.
That's about right.
Yeah.
So south of Roger, it's a very different context than north of Roger. And actually around like Glen, between Glen and Grant, it's 70 to 80 feet. So that's very tight. So we'll have to think long and hard how we approach that. There will be, even on the 4-lane, based on just our initial kind of view, there will be some structural takings as well as acquisitions of frontage, parking spaces, and other things.
Sure.
Obviously, it reduces that. And I believe north of Roger, it opens up quite a bit, and it's actually 100 plus and 120 plus in some locations. That was a lot of newer development. It kind of came in after our major streets and routes plan took effect, and the setbacks are much larger. But particularly south of, I would say, Fort Lowell more so, it's a lot of stuff that's really tight in there. So that will be a consideration in design, is how can we minimize those impacts.
Sure, great. Okay, thanks. All right, any other discussion?
Yeah, quick question, if I may. If you recall, at the last meeting, we discussed sub-regional impacts to any alternatives. Just wondering if Patrick can talk about any sub-regional impacts for no build versus 4 and 6.
Yeah. So in terms of the continuity of the corridor, the 4-lane provides that continuity. It would tie in with First Avenue north of River Road. It would be continuous of the median separated, 4-lane divided. And then south, we would have that lane continuation of the 4 lanes. You know, we'd obviously be going to the 2-way left turn lane. In terms of impact on parallel corridors, we haven't done the modeling in terms of what the volume impacts on those on the parallel corridors would be, but our assumption would be that you wouldn't see a lot of kind of vehicle deflection off of those corridors when compared to the 2030 outcomes, because the congestion levels, the level of service would be similar or better, as I've stated, than what was committed to voters. So it wouldn't have that sub-regional impact beyond what was committed in 2006. Now, if we were comparing the 2045 6-lane to the 2045 4-lane, that's another level of that we haven't done at this point. But
yeah, I would suggest that would be really helpful for everybody to kind of compare apples and apples and look at the volumes based on whether it's 4 lanes or 6 lanes and compare that. That would be really helpful.
Great, thanks, Farhad. Any other discussion by anyone? Robin, you have anything else you want to add? Patrick? Okay.
Hey, Curtis, just one on timing. Robin, this one, we're obviously in the 4th period of the RTA 20-year plan. Was there any reason why this one wasn't considered an earlier project?
I think it was already in the later areas, and when we started it, we thought that we'd get through the feasibility program quicker, and that it just went slower than we thought, partly because of outreach and partly because of pandemic. But we would rather get it done sooner than later. There's just too many, especially safety issues up and down that corridor, and the sooner we do something about them, the better off we're generally going to be.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Chair, just real quickly, I did want to clarify one thing, and I'm not sure, John, if this is where you were going with this, but the implementation periods of the RTA plan, we had 4 of them. First Avenue was actually a 3rd period plan implementation project. So it just is one that, as I think Ms. Rain noted, has some challenges, and they've been working through them.
Okay.
Great, thank you. So, well, this is the first project that our task force is reviewing. So we have to kind of, John and I are ping-ponging as co-chairs. I guess we have to kind of, we have a directed Ouija forward from here. And I know Jim wants to be able to present some progress to the, the regional council coming up, Jim, meeting?
Mr. Vice Chair or Co-Chair. We have Co-Chair. Sorry, we do have a meeting next week of the Technical Management Committee, And I would like to ask that the project task force give an update at that, and then just as to where you stand in the progress. We could do a blended thing where I could present, you could present, however we would like to do that. It is agendaized, and we do have a board meeting at the near the end of the month that I think it would be appropriate to give a TMC report that would include both the actions of the TMC and the TMC Project Review Task Force.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, in order to move things along, what I will offer to do, if the task force doesn't have any objection, is to draft a format for our reviews. And we did this under Paul Sella's leadership before. We kind of mocked up what our reports are going to look like. Of course, under Paul's leadership, I think we reviewed something like a dozen projects. So far, we only have 3 and a possible couple more. So what I would offer to do is to mock up a report format for us, and using this as an example with a big caveat on the top, not for release or whatever on it. And over the next few days, and just through Jim, maybe we can get that back out to the task force. Then the task force can start thinking, what are your own opinions on this, and what do you think at this point the recommendation for the task force might be. What I would also suggest is if there's a strong divergence of opinion for any reason from us, that we have a majority and a minority opinion as well. I'm hoping we can come out of this with a majority opinion, but if there is a divergence, we can indeed come up with 2 separate iterations or comments from those who disagree as well. So,
Mr. Co-Chair?
Yes.
I think it's worth mentioning to the City of Tucson representatives that our process will entail drafting our report and perhaps with a recommendation, and then sharing that with the lead agency for their review and reaction before we finalize.
Right.
Just so you know, Robin and Patrick.
Yeah. In one of our previous discussions, Robin and Patrick, what we kind of structured our work parallel almost to like an inspector general, where a report is prepared and reviewing some action or some function by an agency, and then just exactly as John said, they get a written draft and can respond to it, and then we can take those responses and those concerns into consideration as we finalize the report.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Fair enough.
So I would, Jim, I would offer to do that in the next few days, so that when we do have the RTA meeting, we can at least, we can honestly say that we're making some forward progress. A draft recommendation, report format is underway, and that we would expect within a month or roughly of having some recommendations back to the technical management committee. Make sense to everybody?
Yeah. Hey, Kurt, maybe we should ask Frank and Bill and Bob if any of the stuff that Jim shared with us, all the reference documents, if there's any issues or questions about those.
Oh yeah, what
Anybody?
John said.
Anybody? No.
I don't
I
have
don't
any
think so.
issues or concepts.
I
The
don't have
amount of material is phenomenal, and I haven't been through all of it yet, but it's really helpful.
Yeah. Good. Thanks.
And I'd like to just echo that it's well done and helpful. Thank you.
Great. Patrick, if you could, in the near future, provide that information from Kittleson on the intersection analysis, or alternatively, you could just have Jim Shane call me and we can talk about it. I don't want to get, I know how voluminous the synchro reports can be. I don't want to literally go through 1,000 pages of printout on this. I just have kind of a few questions to ask Jim, and I can do that directly with Jim Shane as a sidebar.
Okay. Yeah, I'll follow up with the Kittleson team and see what they have off the shelf that they produced as part of that analysis.
Okay. And Jim, I just one last comment on protocol. If there are comments coming in from the public on our proceedings, should we redirect those comments to you?
Yeah, I believe it would be appropriate for comments to come into us. We would keep a log of them and make them publicly available.
Yeah, rather than for us to respond to them individually.
I'm not going to tell you how to handle them, but if it's going to be something that's dealt with as a group, it should be dealt with very openly. I mean, put it out there.
All right, great. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would also add that, if there is any additional information that the city would like to have posted online on our site, we'd be happy to put it up there. Any
Okay.
background information. Not sure that we want to put the synchro stuff up, but I'm open to it if you really want to.
Well, if you have trouble falling asleep, it's very good for helping that problem. Anyhow, so we'll meet again in 2 weeks, I guess, right, Jim?
Yeah, that would be the next scheduled meeting.
Yeah, and then John or I or both of us can show up at the meeting next week, is it?
Yes, yeah, it would be next Wednesday at 9 a.m.
Yeah. Is that a Zoom meeting or in person?
I believe it's, Farhad, do you recall, is this a hybrid?
Yes, so that's the TMC meeting. The TMC meetings are hybrid. You're more than welcome to attend either in person or remotely.
Yeah, good, okay. I
Maybe
noticed.
we can talk about that, Kurt.
Yeah, okay, we'll do that. I noticed both Fry's and Walmart were giving away for free N95 masks today. So that's an omen of something. I don't want to predict what, but hopefully we can get together. And I kind of miss seeing Bill and Frank and Bob. So it'd be nice to see them in person at some time. Okay. Anything else, guys? What else do we have on our agenda, Jim? Adjournments?
I think that's it.
Okay.
Thank you for meeting my time constraint.
Oh yeah, no problem.
Appreciate it.
John, do you want to make a motion to adjourn?
I so move.
Okay. I think I heard Frank second.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
See you in 2 weeks. Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Robin.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity.